Some selected words from Paul's letter to the congregation in Rome. What can be known about God is perfectly plain to human beings, since God has made it plain to them ever since the creation of the world. The invisible existence of God, his everlasting power, have been clearly seen by the mind's understanding of all created things. And so these people have no excuse. They knew God, yet they did not honor him as God. And so their arguments became futile, and their uncomprehending minds were darkened. While they claimed to be wise, in fact, they grew so stupid that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an imitation, for the image of a mortal human being. Therefore, by the mercies of God, my friends, present yourselves to him as living sacrifices, which is your reasonable service. A volume I turn to from time to time for inspiration is entitled My Grandfather's Blessings. It's written by Dr. Rachel Naomi Remain, a physician who's worked for over 30 years with cancer patients. In a chapter entitled Knowing Life, she writes of a young man faced with a dire form of bone cancer. He'd been diagnosed many years ago. As a college student, a biopsy had confirmed the doctor's suspicion of cancer, and he and his parents had been called in for a meeting. Sadly, the doctor told them of his findings and strongly recommended that he have his right leg amputated at the hip. He was 19 years old. Despite the urging of several doctors as well as his parents, he refused the surgery, went home to his parents' farm without any treatment to live out his life. Nothing further had been done for him except that the pastor of his church had asked people who were so moved to pray for him at 7 o'clock every night. And people did for over 2 years. And over time, the mass in his thigh had simply grown smaller and finally disappeared. A research friend of mine, she writes, was captivated by this whole story. Although his work had developed in him a healthy skepticism, the whole story seemed so genuine and matter of fact that he couldn't get it out of his mind. And finally he called me to ask for a favor. Would I mind trying to track down the doctor who made the original diagnosis and see if he could confirm the story, if he'd kept medical records or even a biopsy report? Turned out to be easy. The doctor, a relatively young man at the time he treated this patient, was listed in his state's medical association, and he was still in practice. Encouraged, I called him and got him on the phone. After the usual introductions, I told him that I was calling to see if he kept the medical records on a certain patient. So long ago, I doubted that he would remember. But then I told him the man's name, and his response was immediate. Of course I remember him, he said with feeling. I've thought of him many times over the years. What a senseless tragedy. Are you calling on behalf of the family? No, I replied, and told him the man was still alive. Thank God, he said. Where did he have his surgery? He didn't, I replied. There was a pause. When he spoke again, I could detect a change in his voice. Then what happened? So I told him the story. There was a long silence, and then, without another word, he hung up the phone. I called him several times afterward, but he never returned my calls. Now, Dr. Remain does not try to explain any of this. She just goes on to say this. Most of us encounter a great deal more mystery in life than we're willing to experience. Sometimes knowing life requires us to suspend disbelief, to recognize that all our hard-won knowledge may only be provisional, and the world may be quite different than we believe it to be. This can be very stressful, even frightening. But if we are not willing to wonder, we may have to hang up the phone on life. I think the story of the good doctor puts the finger on one of the challenges of life in the modern secular world. We are, a strange people. On the one hand, except for India, we're the most religious people on the face of the planet. 9 Americans in 10 say they have never doubted the existence of God. I'm afraid I'm not one of those. 8 in 10 say they believe that they'll be called before God on Judgment Day to answer for their sins. 8 in 10 believe that God still works miracles, believe that Jesus is God or Son of God, say they've given a fair amount of thought about their relationship to God, say prayer is an important part of their daily life. clearly the atheists among us have it rather difficult. They're under 5% of the population. They admit they're having a hard time of it, centered in certain intellectual and cultural elites. They're even getting a bit belligerent about it, wishing to avoid the negative connotations of the word atheist, some of them out in Massachusetts, where else, now insist on being called brights, as in we are the brights, suggesting, of course, that we who believe in God are not very. So all is well with American faith. Yet Billy Graham even can declare that America is no longer a Christian nation. It is, he says, a secular country in which thousands of Christians live. The prominent Roman Catholic theologian, Father Avery Dulles, is of the same mind. He argues that the country's spiritual and moral breakdown is threatening our future. The Jewish medical educator David Stolinsky laments the loss of the Christian values that have dominated us historically. You see, there are facts that run counter to the pious picture that Americans paint of themselves. Only 20% of Protestants and 28% of Catholics attend church in any given week. Gallup refers to a nation of biblical illiterates and presents some pretty solid evidence. Less than half of American Christians can name the four Gospels. Only 3 in 10 teenagers know why Easter is celebrated. 2/3 of believers say they never read the Bible. Incidentally, 1/3 of Methodists and Presbyterians say they believe in astrology. An in-depth random survey of Americans concludes that 1/3 of Americans are totally secular in their outlook toward life, and 1/3 are barely or nominally religious. So Robert Wuthnow, a respected sociologist at Princeton, argues that most Americans seem to spend most of their time and thought and energies consumed by their daily jobs. He says, as psychiatrists, divorce lawyers, and millions of latchkey children know all too well, spend their days locked into pursuits that involve money or cash or status or pleasure in the quest for personal happiness. And Robert Wuthnow concludes that we therefore go about our lives pretty much the same as those who have no faith at all. What I have called functional atheism, life that is lived without any driving need on any given day to take into account the presence of God. Now, if this seems harsh, let me add that I also find it very understandable, because we live in a culture where media and education tend to erode sensitivity toward things religious, at least until a Mel Gibson comes along. I think Dr. Remain put her finger on one: the loss of a sense of mystery. Over against what? The view of the world around us as material forces to be controlled, as problems to be solved and explained, reality as an array of tasks to be managed. Reality, as the secular world presses it upon us, has become demystified in the precise sense of that word. But what if the eternal becomes real only to the soul that is open to the incredible, the mysterious, the soul that has some sense of wonder about that world out there? The apostle takes it for granted that God is known to everyone in the wonder and mystery of his creation, unless they close their eyes and focus only on the stuff. This whole creation, he argues, breathes of a powerful and indeed loving mystery behind it all. And it is in sensitivity to that reality that we stay alive to God. One cardiologist likes to recite this verse: days pass and the years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. Lord, fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing. Let there be moments when your presence, like lightning, illumines the darkness in which we walk. Help us to see wherever we gaze that the bush burns unconsumed, and we, clay touched by God, will reach out and exclaim in wonder, how filled with awe is this place, and we did not know it. and we did not know it. And from a cardiologist, no less. I'm tempted to say that if we want God to stay a real part of our lives, we need to spend it part of each day outdoors. Except that outdoors around here is in so many ways sealed off from God's world, is it not? The daily lights conceal the stars, the birds disease takes away, the bushes that burn. Moreover, most of the time, we're passing through on the way to trains and tasks with our eyes on concrete. Against a culture that tends to flatten things out, explain everything, we need to nurture our capacity for wonder at the things that never will be explained. Let your kids help you. They're good at it. So mystery. And we also live in a culture which not so much flagrantly undermines morality, although it probably does that in some corners, as it does call into question the voice of your conscience and mine as the voice of God. Guilt is no longer a sign that we're violating the will of God, that we're dealing with Him, but rather a sign of a therapeutic problem. Hence, its weight and authority. The weight and authority of conscience has been diminished, and we learn to ignore it in other preoccupations and diversions. When I was a kid, I was taught that my conscience was the voice of God. And then I took Psychology 101, and I learned it was really the voice of my mother. But the reality is, I've lived long enough, and I hope am a bit wiser, and have been led to ask a very important question: where did Mother get the voice? It's interesting that the psalmist and Paul, in fact the whole of Scripture, see failure to believe in God for most people as not an intellectual but a moral problem. Atheism, intellectual or functional, is in some sense rebellion against authority. And authority does not have much weight in the lives of even those who believe in this day and age. We disobey conscience at great peril. It's no less than the great psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, who can write, "There are immutable laws inherent in human nature and human functioning which operate in any given culture. And these laws cannot be violated without serious damage to the person. If someone violates his conscience, his moral and intellectual integrity, he weakens or even paralyzes his whole personality. He will be unhappy, he will be miserable, he will suffer." We begin Lent this week, a season that goes all the way back to the early days of Christendom, a time that was set aside for self-examination. Not a very popular and common word in our time. That is to say, listening to God in the voice of conscience, because unless we do, there is no opportunity for growth. Growth comes as the awareness of the tension between the way things are in our life today and where they ought to go. Unfortunately, as with so many religious habits, it's become trivialized over time into giving up candy if you're a kid or giving up the martini if you're an adult. Now, I grew up in a Baptist church, and around this time of year, our attitude was, we are so strict that there's really nothing left for us to give up for Lent. But the life of faith, life with God, is, after all, a life under orders. And if we're not willing to listen, there's really no practical place for a real God in our day. The great Howard Thurman, Boston University, gives us an example of what such self-examination might look like. He writes, "We assess our stewardship of life, our undertakings and enterprise. We're aware of the vast responsibility which is ours. In so many ways, we have probably been silent where we should have spoken. We've withheld the hand when we should have extended it. We've been blind to so much that we would not see. There are doors of truth into which we've not entered because of our preoccupation with lesser things and minor goals. In our private lives, we've failed to meet the inner demands of our own conscience. We've done violence to the truth that is within us. On the other hand, there have been so many moments of wholeness in which we've participated, when we've felt cleansed. We've been surrounded by so much of grace and goodness in which we've shared consciously and deliberately. We've been cognizant of needs that extend beyond our family and friends. So we acknowledge before Thee, O God, the mixture of life which is ours, so much that is unworthy, so much that is good. So many times, Father, we've mounted upon wings as eagles because of the upward sweep of Thy Spirit within us. So often we've groveled in the mud, unworthy of the good that we know. So we spread our lives out before Thee, complete and utter, scrutinize them with Thy great wisdom. Pour out upon us in abiding measure Thy Spirit, without which we will stumble in the darkness and perish. Sense of mystery, sense of moral seriousness, and then I think also in today's culture, the loss of a sense of meaning. That is to say, meaning beyond our own activity and choices, our own labors and loves. Certainly the culture around us does its best to counter that move. Film and novel and pop philosophy and playwrights suggest that there really is no meaning to the whole mess. But without a sense of meaning, not much of God, really. Robert Fulghum has a story which for me illuminates what might be the meaning of your day here and mine. By the time I came to the Institute for a summer session, Alexander Papaderos had become a living legend. One look at him, you saw his strength and intensity, energy, physical power, courage, intelligence, passion, the vivacity radiating from his person. And to speak to him, to shake his hand, to be in a room with him when he spoke was to experience his extraordinary humanity. Few people live up to their reputation when you get up close to them, but Alexander Papaderos was an exception. At the last session of the last morning of a 2-week seminar on Greek culture, led by intellectuals and experts in their fields, who were recruited by Papaderos from all over Greece, Papaderos himself rose from his chair at the back of the room and walked to the front, where he stood in the bright Greek sunlight of an open window and looked out. We followed his gaze across the bay to the iron cross marking the German cemetery. He turned and made a ritual gesture, "Are there any questions?" And quiet quilted the room. These 2 weeks had generated enough questions for a lifetime, but for now there was only silence. No questions? Papaderos swept the room with his eyes. So I asked one, "Dr. Papaderos, what is the meaning of life?" When the laughter died down and the people stirred to leave, Papaderos held up his hand, looked at me for a long time as if asking with his eyes whether I was really serious about my question. And seeing I was, he said, "I will answer your question." Taking out his wallet in his hip pocket, he fished into that leather billfold and brought out a very small round mirror about the size of a quarter. And what he said went like this. When I was a small child during the war, we were very poor, lived in a remote village. One day on the road, I found the broken pieces of a mirror. A German motorcycle had been wrecked on that spot, and I tried to find all the pieces and put them back together, but it was not possible. So I kept only the largest piece, this one. And by scratching it on a stone, I managed to make it quite round. And I began to play with it as a toy. I became fascinated by the fact that I could reflect light into the dark places where the sun would never reach, in deep holes and crevices and dark closets, and it became a game for me to get light into the most inaccessible places I could find. So I kept the little mirror, and as I went about growing up, I would take it out from time to time in idle moments and continue the little game. But as I became an adult, I grew to understand that I was not the light. I was not the source of the light. But light, truth, understanding, knowledge is there, and it will only shine in many dark places if I reflect it. So I see myself as a fragment of a mirror whose whole design and shape I do not really understand. Nevertheless, with what I have, I can reflect light into some dark places in this world, into the dark places in the hearts of some of those around me. and change some things for some people, and perhaps others may see and do likewise. But this is what I'm about. This is the meaning of my life. What if at rock bottom, the meaning of your life and mine, to which God calls us in all our labors and avocations, our world and neighborhood, our family and friendships, is to reflect there, somehow, imperfectly perhaps, something of the light, the Spirit present in Jesus of Nazareth, and present in the towering figures who have embodied that same Spirit down through the centuries? What if the purpose of our days is to mirror His ways in what we say and do? Ought that not be enough to keep us busy until we depart?